Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to bring you the next installment in my ongoing series of videos all about the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. Just in case you've never seen the show, what it was a half-hour kids television show that always had two different storylines going on in each episode. One storyline was an adaptation of a canonical work, so that most frequently meant a book, but it could also be a play or a collection of stories, folk tales, and the like. And then the other storyline was a modern, aka 1990s, story that focused on a family living in Texas with their pet Jack Russell Terrier Wishbone. And that modern storyline always related back to the adaptation in some kind of a way. In this series of videos I do here on my channel, I look at one episode of Wishbone per video. I compare the two different storylines to the work that they chose to take on, and I comment on whether or not I think they did it justice. I talk about what they chose to include from the famous work, what they chose to leave out, and why they might have made those choices. I try to underline any moral message that they might have been trying to draw out of the work and communicate to their very young audience. And at the end of the day, I make a final judgment on whether or not I personally thought it made an entertaining half hour of television. In today's video, we will be looking at the episode of Wishbone that takes on the classic folktale collection, The Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights. The collection seems to be called both things interchangeably, as my research indicated anyway, but more specifically, this episode of Wishbone looks at the tale of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves in a mid-season 1 episode entitled 1001 Tales, spelled T-A-I-L-S. Very cute. Let's take a look. What's the story, Wishbone?
What's the story, Wishbone? What's this you're dreaming of?
At the start of this episode, Wishbone's owner Joe and his friend Sam are helping their mutual friend David set up his brand new computer, and all three of them are extremely excited about getting a magical new thing called the internet. A few clicks later and the kids are completely absorbed by an online game. Wishbone the dog comes in and says that instead of getting all wrapped up in a video game, he would much rather get lost in a good story, which proves to be the perfect opportunity for him to introduce what he is calling the 1001 Arabian Nights, which is a collection of tales from India, Persia, and Arabia. He starts off by discussing the story surrounding this collection, which is the story of a young queen who was going to be killed, going to be executed by her husband, the king. But she was able to stall her execution because every single night she would tell her husband, the king, a new story that had an open end. He would be so desperate to hear the ending of that story the next night that her execution kept getting put off for a total of 1001 nights. This young queen acts as a narrator of the story within a story in this episode of Wishbone. She begins telling the tale of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Ali Baba, played by Wishbone of course, is a poor merchant who gets lost in the desert and encounters a group of bandits who gather in front of a mysterious cave. Just in time, he hides. Meanwhile in Texas, Joe and Wishbone's eccentric neighbor Wanda is in a rush to get out of the house for some reason, and she leaves her purse sitting on the back of her car. Wishbone tries in vain to warn her that it's back there. He's a dog. There's only so much he can do. But she drives away. It falls off. She leaves it behind. Wishbone would have gone to retrieve it and kept it for her because he is kind of Lassie-like in that way. But David's little sister Emily gets her paws on the purse first. David, like Wishbone, is also facing a dilemma because he wants to join a chat room on this newfound thing called the internet, but he doesn't know the password. And back in the story adaptation, where Ali Baba is hiding from the bandits, those bandits accidentally reveal the password "Open Sesame" while Ali Baba is still hiding. After they leave, he goes into the cave and sees an unbelievable amount of treasure. He decides to take one bag of coins with him. David starts to get an inkling that this chat room that he really wants to join has something to do with stolen money. But thievery is actually a whole lot closer to home than he may think, because Emily, flush with cash from Wanda's wallet that she found, asks David to take her to the candy store. David and Wishbone try to get the wallet back from her, and in an absurd turn of events in their scuffle, an account transfer is accidentally initiated on the new computer. Wanda has now realized that her purse is missing, and she's on the hunt for it when the feds show up at David's house, asking David's dad to verify his checking account balance. It turns out that account transfer wasn't out, it was in. And now over $3 million of stolen money is in David's family account. Back in the story adaptation, Wishbone as Alibaba takes the money to his greedy brother's house and tells him the whole story of how he found it. His brother wants to go back and get more money, but Alibaba says no. Well, his brother goes anyway and is so overwhelmed by the riches that he stays in the cave long enough for the cave door to close. But he forgets the password to get out, and so he's stuck in there. Thankfully, Alibaba shows up and saves his brother before the bandits get back. We're told that Alibaba was patient and only went back to the cave after the 40 thieves had died. The queen, the one telling this whole tale, has so captured the king's interest with this story and the promise of others, like the tale of Aladdin and Sinbad the Sailor, that the king decides to completely call off her execution. David finally manages to catch up with his little sister, who he's been chasing this entire time, and he tells her she has to give the purse back because that's not her money. And then when he gets back to the house, the feds want to talk to David about what he knows about the stolen money that's now in the family account. He tells the feds how he cracked the code that the thieves were using in the chat room and figured out that they were talking about stolen money, and he figures out how the money got into his dad's account in the first place. He realizes that an accident may have happened. Right at that moment, a new message pops up on the screen from the chat room, and David can tell, because he cracked the code, that it means the thieves are headed to the airport, and the feds are hot on the case. Then Wishbone shows up with Wanda's missing purse that he's retrieved from Emily, and instead of getting a pat on the back like he deserves, he takes the blame for stealing it. Poor Wishbone. So let's talk about this episode. Right off the bat, let me just say that this is one of the most entertaining episodes of Wishbone that I have seen and covered for this series thus far. And that is, of course, partially because this is such an over-the-top story, but also because there's this really cool time capsule element to this episode because of the presence of the internet. It is so cool seeing and hearing these kids talk about this fun new thing called the internet that they've heard a lot of good things about. It's hard to remember a time before the internet was such a part of all of our everyday lives, but that was a part of my childhood. I mean, that's my generation where we had the time in our lives where the internet wasn't everywhere, and then all of a sudden the internet exploded onto the scene. So it definitely takes me back. But this story, I mean, thieves talking in code on a public chat room about the theft of millions of dollars, a code that is obviously so simple that a kid could break it and understand what they're talking about. Then there's the accidental unauthorized account transfer of millions of dollars. Even just that banking software that showed up on the screen was hysterical. And then there's the fact that the feds showed up on David's family's doorstep moments after the account transfer happened. It is all just so over the top. But I do fully recognize that, of course, it's absurd to me, an adult, watching this almost 25 years later, and I've had many years worth of experience with the internet. I know what it's capable of. I know what it's not capable of. I don't think a kid watching this at the time would have seen much of any of this as ridiculous. I don't know if kids now would be a little bit more aware that this is pretty over the top, that this isn't realistic, because kids really don't have a whole lot of experience with banking, or at least I hope they don't. They're a little bit too young for that. So they might not realize that. And they also might not realize that it's completely unrealistic that the feds would show up moments later unless it's like a really, really hot, huge investigation. I think when you're talking about crime, kids associate crime with the police, in this case the FBI, so it makes sense that they would be there in a child's eyes anyway. In terms of the way the two different storylines meshed together and fit together, I think it worked for the most part. I do think the storyline about the purse, I do think that element felt very tacked on, where Emily accidentally steals Wanda's purse, but I'm sure that was a very toned down attempt to show one of the characters on the show stealing. I'm sure they wanted to keep characters pretty squeaky clean. They don't want to accuse any of these characters who they want us to love of being thieves. So instead they show this really little girl, Emily, accidentally stealing, but not really understand that that's what she was doing. So thus far, I've determined that I think this episode was very entertaining, and I think the two storylines work fairly well together. So we're off to a great start. However, things start to fall apart a little bit when we look at the other elements of this episode. For example, the moral message. The moral message in this episode is cloudy at best, contradictory at worst. And what I mean by that is that when David catches up with his little sister Emily, trying to get the purse back from her, he gives her this whole lecture about how that purse isn't hers just because she found it. She has to give it back, otherwise that's stealing. Well then, shouldn't that same logic apply to everywhere else in the episode? Like, we're told that Ali Baba gets to keep the riches in the cave after the 40 thieves die. Is that really his to take just because he was patient enough to wait for it? If that's the case, then shouldn't David's family also get to keep that $3 million? Should they just wait out the feds? I'm not advocating for that, by the way. I don't actually believe that. I just do think there are a lot of different mixed messages going on in this episode. Emily can't keep the money, but Ali Baba can, and David's family can't, even though they didn't ask for it. I am sure the message that they wanted to communicate in this episode to kids is don't steal, but that's not what I was getting from it. They also really toned down the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves to include in this episode, which I understand why they did that, because, for example, Ali Baba's brother, the one who went back to the cave and got stuck in there, Ali Baba doesn't come and rescue him in the story itself. He's found in there by the 40 thieves and they brutally murder him. There are also several different attempts by the leader of the 40 thieves to take Ali Baba's life. They know that he knows where the cave is, so they want him gone. They try to kill him several different times. It's thwarted by the women in his life, and they actually orchestrate the downfall of this group of 40 thieves. They kill a lot of them. So you can see why they would want to water some of that down for a kids show. But there was actually one element of the episode that was very faithful to the story, and that's the fact that Ali Baba waited for a long time before he went back to that cave to claim his riches. I mean, in the story, he knows that they're dead, so he's waiting it out just to be safe. In the episode, they're claiming, I guess, that the 40 thieves died naturally. They just died as if they would have normally, as though they wouldn't have had any descendants that they would have told about massive riches in a cave somewhere. But that's neither here nor there. So is the message actually that you should just play the long game when you find money? Don't tell anyone about it, and then it'll eventually become yours? Like if Emily hadn't blabbed to David about this wallet and shoved money in his face to take her to the candy store, would that money eventually have become hers? Again, I'm not saying I agree with that, but do you see what I mean about the muddled message? Like, I just don't know what they were trying to communicate. So all in all, I think this was a very entertaining episode of Wishbone. And I always love when they step outside of the Western canon. They don't do it very much, so I always really try to savor those episodes. But I do think that this one was ultimately confused. Like, I just don't know what they were trying to say. And I think they ended up saying some kind of negative things, encouraging some negative things. However, I do think this episode would get kids more interested in reading this story collection. I mean, if I hadn't have already read it, it would make me want to pick it up. And I do think that's one of the goals of this series. So it's a win in that regard, in my opinion. So those were my thoughts on this episode of Wishbone. If you have any comments or questions about anything you've seen in this video or about anything in general, please feel free to put those in the comment section below. If you'd like to see more of these What's the Story Wishbone videos, be sure to check out the playlist that I've created. It's in the description box below, and also in the description box you can find links to everywhere you can find me across the internet if you're interested in keeping up with what I'm reading and writing about right now. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.
Funding for Wishbone provided by annual financial support from PBS viewers like you.